Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam, for the introduction. 我係方碧森，多倫多星報嘅記者。今天晚上我很高興跟你們在一起。Let me begin by talking about a front page story I recently came across. It was about a Vancouver City councillor, and he was constantly fielding complaints from residents who couldn't make ends meet in the city. You know, he said wages during the last few years have increased, yes, but not in proportion to the increased cost of living. I have personally investigated to some extent, he said, enough to convince me that there is something radically wrong. This city, the councillor said, should be the most attractive city on the coast, where a man of average means and income may live and enjoy life and bank a small percentage of his wages if he is of a thrifty disposition. There are families in Vancouver, which I am convinced now are working hard solely so they may eat and have a roof over their heads. And there should be more to life than that, a little pleasure out of the day's hard-earned wages as well as sustenance. So the councillor, as many politicians have done before and since, argued it was time for, of course, a committee to be struck to look at why it was that it was so hard to accomplish that very basic desire: happiness, contention, a home of our own. That interview about the need to strike a committee to look at why Vancouver residents felt so unsettled in their own city was on the front page of the Vancouver Sun. It was actually in the first ever edition of the Vancouver Sun, published on February 12th, 1912. So I wanted to think about a little bit about what does this tell us about who we are, that this article came out 100 years ago. For me, what I took away from that article was that there is an assumption that because Vancouver has so much to offer us naturally, we assume that our individual place within the city should also come so naturally. And as someone who has probably written about a committee being struck as a policy topic more than any other in my journalism career, it told me that this need for us to strike committees, to navel gaze, and to find answers as to why our fit into our city isn't as naturally perfect as our city has been around for at least a century, or almost as long as we have been a city. And one last point I wanted to talk about when I was looking at this 100-year-old article and thinking about what it tells us about ourselves is not only did this alderman want this committee to find out why so many people in Vancouver were unhappy with their present situation, he also wanted to know what other cities were doing, whether they were experiencing the same thing. And this need to compare ourselves, and I would be interested in your thoughts on this, is a very Vancouver thing, I think. It gave me some insight as I was preparing for this talk tonight, that even back then, we had a need to know. We want to know why we are so restless, why we are so unsettled and so isolated from each other and from the rest of the country. And we want to know if other cities, like Toronto, are dealing with the same issues. So I was looking up, and as an outsider looking at Vancouver sometimes, I wanted to go even more outside, and I wanted to look at how other people see us. So I went to the Lonely Planets Canada, most recent edition, and I wanted to see how they describe Toronto or Vancouver. So let's do a little quiz. Polite yet edgy. Who do you think that is? You're right. Hitting the streets on foot means you'll come across a kaleidoscope of distinctive neighborhoods, each one almost like a village itself. Vancouver, Toronto? Vancouver. Urban, yet green. And of course, the image of Rob Ford comes to mind. Toronto. You know, when I first became the Western Bureau Chief of the Toronto Star 5 years ago, I thought I knew my beat. I had spent nearly a dozen years at the Vancouver Sun, initially hired as an agriculture reporter from Saskatchewan, and then I reported for Toronto editors at the Globe and Mail. I corrected their corrections. Yes, Steveston is really spelled that way. And I told them, yes, that really is the average price of a West Side bungalow. And of course, I agree with them that I really should be in the Haida Gwaii to write that story, but I couldn't do it in an afternoon. But little of this background prepared me for covering Vancouver in the West. You know, I'd grown up in Calgary, received my education in Saskatchewan, wrote about mosquito fogging in Winnipeg in one of my first journalism jobs. But knowing the West is different, I soon had to quickly learn from understanding how to portray it to someone outside of our region. You know, I failed consistently and I failed often. There would be weeks when I couldn't get a story into the paper. And as many journalists know, you know, there are really some painful words you hear from an editor, but probably none more painful than, "That's not our kind of story." You think you know your city, but it's only when you have to see it from the viewpoint of someone who lives and works thousands of kilometers away, whose history is that much different from ours, and the landscape which they walk past daily, so unlike our own, that I realize that seeing the West as a foreign country helps. Forget what binds us together. It's the differences that, at least for me, as a Western correspondent, makes for good stories. I probably could have saved myself a lot of missteps if I had read that 100-year-old article 5 years ago when I first began this job. Both here inside our city and outside, I think the perception is that we are truly blessed to live where we live. George Woodcock wrote about Vancouver for the Toronto Star about 4 decades ago, and he described us this way: our bland, rainy climate, combined with mountains, sheltered waterways, foster a uniquely hedonistic existence, the renowned lotus land on the shores of the Gulf of Georgia. And I think that is how, in my experience, many in Toronto view us, as having a renowned lotus life, and for a few of us, maybe a hedonistic one as well. But, you know, the stories that resonate for Toronto Star readers are stories that tell us about why life in Lotus Land remains for us now, as it did 100 years ago, a quest. How can we be unhappy? You know, why would we be lonely? Last spring, I joined a group, and we all have a common interest. We're all shy. Our motto is "Shy People Unite." It, honest to God, is a real group. When I first joined last spring, you know, there were 800 of us, and today there are 2,400 of us shy folks here in Vancouver. And you would recognize us stereotypically. You know, we don't make eye contact. And on Monday nights when we go to Memphis Blues for all-you-can-eat ribs night, no one ever asks for more ribs. And when we go and do hikes, we do walk in a single file. But, you know, we still gather together because even in a city where loneliness and isolation is so much a part of us, we at least don't have to be alone. You know, a few weeks ago, the Vancouver Foundation released its study about how social isolation was a bigger concern for residents here than social ills like homelessness. And just last week, HSBC polled immigrants who found that Vancouver was the least friendly city among urban centers in Canada. Stories like this play well in Toronto because it asks the questions that we have been asking ourselves for as long as we have grouped together as a population and considered ourselves residents of Vancouver. What unites us and what fascinates us to people outside is this disconnect, the struggle that we have had for more than a century to understand why in such a perfect setting we remain so persistently unsettled. Thank you very much.